Hey, I'm John Marie Solis with INNIS 2022 Neurodiversity Conference, and I am here with C.A. Watts, who is going to join me in a conversation about ADHD and why it's always been here and why it's good and all kinds of things that I can't wait to hear about and learn about and discuss. Uh, C.A. Watts is an educator, a teacher, an academic, a PhD candidate, all kinds of really cool things. But for me, the value is a really honest and sincere and beautiful human who I am really, really getting to enjoy knowing. And so, Courtney, thank you so much for being willing to talk about this topic. It's a way of approaching ADHD that like nobody else is talking about, which is part of why I think it is so cool. Can you just give us a little bit of information about you and then tell us like what is this sort of historic perspective you are bringing to the validity of ADHD?
Well, I'm Courtney. I'm from New South Wales, Australia. I teach in our education system here. I'm multiply neurodivergent, so I have many different conditions, among which is ADHD. And the idea is that the behaviors that are associated with ADHD, the traits that we have, and many of the differences in how our body and brain work actually had a purpose historically. This is pure speculation, obviously, because there's only so much that we can know about early human society. But based on what we do know about how they lived, then it correlates heavily with what we know about ADHD. So it definitely has a strong evidence base for ADHD potentially being an evolutionary throwback to early humanity.
Okay, so for me and my little science geekiness, that's so much fun. I talked to somebody recently who's written a book based on the theory that the character of Jacob in the First Testament of the Bible, some people call that the Old Testament, is autistic. And like that got me really excited because I started thinking about all of the story of the character of Jacob in the Bible and going, oh, that's cool, right? So this idea of ADHD like always being, which I believe, right, and being a benefit, that now we're like somehow the benefit viewpoint got changed over history. It's just so interesting to me. What are some of your aha moments as you were doing this research? What stood out to you?
Well, to be honest, it was the connection that led to me wanting to research it, because I had it was a sleep study that popped up, and it was discussing how in early humanity, humans would sleep in shifts. It wasn't safe for everyone to be asleep all at the same time. And so those people who were guarding the fire at night would have had to have had a very specific skill range and would have developed behavioral adaptations or had inherent genetic adaptations that allowed them to be able to do that effectively. And the more and more I looked into it, the more of those traits correlated with what we know about ADHD today.
So you mentioned to me, I think it's a book. So you were the one guarding the fire. Am I getting that right?
Well, that's going to be the title of the paper. So you were the one who guarded the fire at night.
All right. Yeah. So I describe my inner brain as different animals, and and people. Animals are my thought patterns and people are my emotions. And most of my thought patterns are monkeys. They're very excitable, often very chatty, and occasionally rage and throw poo. And so when I hear an idea, my brain monkeys will like grab the really exciting pieces and get very noisy about them. And I don't always get the links, right? So I will remember a thing, but not necessarily how it's connected. So thank you for correcting that, because I think that's a really cool title. So a sleep study, which is really fascinating to me because one of the things that we know right now about ADHD folks is that sleep often is hard for us. And what you just said made me think about the very first time I was quite little, maybe 3. My first memory of spending the night in New York City. And New York City is called the city that never sleeps. I grew up in the country. My closest neighbor was a half a mile in each direction, very little population. No street lights, so it was very, very dark when I slept. It was just the noises of the insects and the birds and the animals at night. But when I was going to sleep this first time in New York City, there were people awake. And I remember feeling the most safe I had ever felt. And I must have mentioned it because I remember my mom saying, "Oh, well, it's okay. People are going to be up all night long. That's the way the city works." And I just went, that's the best thing in the world. And at this very young age, I became aware that I had some kind of consciousness that if we were all asleep, who would know if something happened that needed attention while we were asleep? And I think that birthed some of my sleep challenges.
Someone has to be awake.
Somebody has to be awake. And so evidently I met my ADHD very early. I just didn't know that's who I was talking to. So this sleep study got like sort of woke this up in you. What next? Like, was it just sort of instant, like, ooh, sleep study, I will do research? Or was there sort of a path to that?
Well, one led to the other, led to another. So the first was the circadian rhythm differences. Delayed sleep phase is really, really common in ADHD. As we struggle to get to sleep, we struggle to stay asleep, and then we find ourselves chronically exhausted throughout the day. And the standard circadian rhythm is usually about the 10 p.m. to the 7 a.m.-ish. It's dependent on the light changes, which is why sleep stages also tend to change between the seasons. And delayed sleep phase, if you have delayed sleep phase disorder, then it means you aren't going to sleep until at least 2 hours after that. So if your natural bedtime falls after midnight, then you more than likely have delayed sleep phase disorder. You're far more likely to not get tired until the early hours of the morning and then sleep through until midday or the early hours of the afternoon, if left to follow your natural circadian rhythm. And now, obviously, way back when, that was highly beneficial for someone to have that that more natural sleep pattern of staying awake most or all of the night. And of course, it wasn't alone. So people would sleep in stages. You'd have some people going to bed at the 10 o'clock and then some at the 12, some at the 2, some at the 4. And so people would be waking up and going to sleep depending on their own cycles. So you were never just awake alone, but it wasn't like a shift system where there was the same people awake and the same people asleep all the time. Now, today, since industrialization, the 9 to 5 workday has changed our system of the workday, of the school day. Everything's during the day. Everything is closed or shut off at night mostly. And so living in settled homes, our need to be awake is no longer there, but everything that we're expected to do during the day is still harder to do because our body is telling us, well, now is the time you should be asleep. And so if you're struggling to sleep at night because it's it's not the time you're meant to be asleep, and then you're having to wake up and go to school or work the next day, you're then going to have a whole lot of ill effects at school and at work because your body's telling you you should be asleep. You're chronically sleep deprived because you can't sleep when you're told you're supposed to, while simultaneously not being able to sleep when you feel you need to. And that creates a whole host of social and academic issues because you can't concentrate to learn, and you're cranky because you're sleep deprived. So you're more likely to get into scuffles with other people because you're not in the right cognitive space because you haven't had enough sleep.
Okay, mind officially blown, and like making connections in my own life and that of my now adult children. And as my work starts to be able to afford to bring on employees, one of the things I'm trying to do with my organizations is develop a workplace that is legitimate for the neurodivergent individual. And so I'm thinking about, well, okay, so that really makes the flexible workday super valuable, right? If there's work that somebody can do for me that isn't tied to the clock, I need to not care if it's happening at 2:00 in the morning, right? And an interesting byproduct of the world getting shut down by COVID is that we did have to learn some other ways of doing things that now couldn't be compulsorily standard. You didn't show up to work. So you did it from home. There are these fun pictures roaming the internet of people like nicely dressed from, their upper body, and then in like shorts and their slippers or, pajama pants on the bottom. To a certain extent, we had to learn to do things a little bit differently. And with this return to quote unquote regular life, a legitimate resistance to a return to the way things were done before. And I think some of that has to do with what you're talking about. We got to discover better organizations for our day when we got to set aside the societally required standard of, the 9 to 5 or the 8 to 4, or whatever it is that you're living. And I think about, you were describing sleep patterns, and I'm like, every teenager ever, right? Like almost, there definitely is teenagers that like their little eyeballs pop open at 5:00 in the morning and they are ready to go, and God bless them, right? But a lot of teenagers are not happy getting out of bed before like 11:00 in the morning. And they're really mad at you when you want them to go to school at 7 in the morning. And what if they didn't have to? What if we believed people could find what works best for them and then decide how to integrate them based on what's best for them? I mean, what a lovely society to live in.
Well, that's one of the should be's that we're working towards. That's the goal. Currently, here in Australia, there have been talks about shifting the beginning of the school day for high schools to a 10 to a 10:30 start, because it's been found that teenagers are not cognitively capable of learning as effectively earlier in the day. It needs to be shifted later to maximize the potential benefits of their education. And in this same sleep study, they were also discussing the age differences, and it went through the young ones were up quite early, teenagers went to bed quite late, and the older generations, your elders, they were quite early risers as well. So they would essentially be the start of the day, and then they would be the ones awake and caring for the young ones. And that was when you would find your standard adults would then be going to bed. So our ADHDers would then be going to bed. So it was always in a cyclical system, and it was based around our natural rhythms and the recognition that everyone had different natural rhythms, and that difference was a protective adaptation that allowed them to have a safer society before we had four walls to protect us.
So as somebody who has always been attracted to promoting somebody's right to be themselves, and no joke, I have memories from preschool and kindergarten of like defending the outcast kid. And, you know, like I was always drawn to standing up for somebody who was ostracized for being different. And, you know, it's an oversimplification and romanticization of more primitive societies to sort of just say, and everything was designed based on, you know, what was good for the person. This is not really accurate. However, that was in the ingredient mix, right? If you were particularly strong and fast, maybe you were sent out to hunt today. And if you weren't particularly strong and fast, you were given a different job, right? Because we weren't trying to force people to go do a thing they weren't designed to do. And we were trying to figure out, what is your design, and how do we, you know, for the benefit of society, how do we make the best use of what your design is? Where today we're aggressively discouraged from figuring out our design. And those of us who appear to be designed differently from the norm are considered disordered or disabled. And so this idea that organized humans had the ingredients for self-awareness, self-evaluation, and self-inclusion. I'm both excited and like so sad, right? I love that was, but like, where did it go? And I think that's a little bit
industrialization.
Right? Yeah.
We stopped being able to share our own designs, and factories handed us one. And so those people that fall outside of that gets the demand to restore to factory settings, back to the standard model that's expected, as opposed to playing to our strengths the way it occurred prior. And it goes far beyond our sleep patterns as well. ADHD brain mapping sees lesser perfusion, which is how the amount of blood that's taken up by different areas of the brain. It's lesser in the temporal lobe, the thalamus, the basal ganglia, the prefrontal cortex, and all of these things are are impacting our memory, our information processing, our executive functioning, our decision making. And so when you have that lesser perfusion, then you're going to have less effectiveness in these functions. And it's got that knock-on effect to development and how we function cognitively. ADHD is our motor control develops faster than our socio-emotional and our cognitive abilities. So there's been a common test since the 80s that if a child can hop on one leg at the age of 4, that's predictive of an ADHD diagnosis at 7, because those greater motor development skills are highly common in ADHDers. They also, we also know that movement is naturally a part of ADHD learning instead of the learning triggering processes in the brain. Instead it's coming from bottom up rather than top down, where the movement in the brain, the movement in the body then impacts the abilities of the brain. And that's why that's where the hyperactivity comes from, because there's less perfusion in these different areas of the brain. The movement is stimulating those areas to provide better focus, to get better blood flow, and that then impacts the cognitive capacities. With the motor development, our reactionary times are lower, and there's greater variability to them naturally on our baseline level. But the second we have any form of stimulation that impacts those areas of the brain, we have a far higher increase in our reaction times. And that's where you get the incredibly lightning fast reflexes in ADHD people. You see it particularly in gaming. ADHDers are so good at gaming, at anything battly, anything requiring fast, almost decisionless reactionary responses. And all of this ties back in to guarding the fire at night. If you were faced with a potential threat, you had to respond immediately. You had to be able to almost react without thinking. You had to have all of your motor movements perfectly in time, because your life and the lives of the society you lived with were relying on those reflexes. When you then look into engaging in set tasks, there was a study done that showed if you try and get an ADHD person engaged in a set task, a not chosen task, there were 2 areas of the brain impacted. Our executive and intentional resources dropped, and our default networks and our sensory motor networks rose. So at the same time, our brain is telling us, no, you're not focusing on this one task. It's increasing your sensory input, or your comprehension of your sensory input from what's happening around you. It is the brain literally telling you it's not safe to focus on one thing. You need to take in everything, or we might die. Now, back then, it kept you alive. Every single change in smell, every sound, every movement coming from the areas around you could be a sign of a potential incoming threat. But now, those sensory sensitivities are not helpful. They're a nuisance. We're stuck being in the day where everything is brighter, everything is louder. We are sleep deprived because this is not our natural circadian rhythm. And that turns that sensory sensitivity that was so beneficial into something incredibly overwhelming. And again, that hyperactivity that we see in attempting to stimulate those areas of the brain to get greater perfusion to the areas, get the blood flowing in those areas of the brain that are normally darker on imaging, is an attempt to focus on something long enough to filter out all of that overwhelming sensory stimuli, to be able to get rid of it enough to hear our own thoughts, where normally, or historically, that wasn't necessary. Nights are dark, they're quiet, there's far less sensory input, so every piece was important. That's just not the case today. And that's where our stimulant medication comes in. If we were to use the movements of our body or natural ways of stimulating those areas in the brain, we'd be chronically exhausted. Before I was medicated, my Fitbit would have me going up to 50,000 steps a day. And that's not sustainable. So the people who are out there not willing to provide appropriate accommodations or alterations to routines and schedules in order to benefit our natural strengths, or at least to not cut us off at the knees by telling us there's a specific way, time that these things have to be done, then the stimulant medication is what's going to provide us with the ability to at least exist to somewhat of a functional degree. And even then, it's not the best thing, not for everyone, because a lot of the targeting we receive as ADHDers for being different, because of the social scuffles that we're constantly getting into due to sleep deprivation and impulsive lack of decisions, and it leads to greater social targeting, more likely to end up injured, greater level of hospitalization, so poorer medical outcomes. All of those things are reasons to seek out the best possible stimulant medication that's going to work in order to reduce those negative interactions. But at the same time, certain medications are not going to work. You need to find the right kind of medication, the right dosage, and particularly the younger you start, the more you're going to have to tweak it as you go. And this often gets parents quite scared because they see it as their child getting a tolerance to it, but they act similarly to painkillers in that it's based on weight. It's based on how you metabolize things, and ADHDers tend to have quite a fast metabolism. And not only that, the greatest area, time of growth we have in human development outside of the infancy stage is the teen stage. And so that's the time when you're likely going to have the hardest time of tweaking the medication to find the right one, because their metabolism is going through the roof. Their growth is almost constant. And so that would mean you would need to be having consistent checkups to make sure the medication is right, it's at the right dosage. And it seems like it's a whole lot of back and forth. A lot of parents don't do it. A lot of parents don't consider the fact that they might need to. And again, that fear of, I don't want them to develop a tolerance to such a hard medication. But the other option is to not And unfortunately, I'm on the other side of that decision. My parents took the opinion that there's nothing wrong with her, she's just naughty, it can be flogged out of her. So I didn't have the opportunity to get medicated until last year, when I could finally get the diagnosis confirmed, despite the fact that it had been suspected since I was 7 years old. And when you consistently go through all of these poor social outcomes as a result of being targeted and not knowing why, that's why neurodivergent kids are far more likely than their neurotypical peers to develop complex PTSD. And once you do that, your options for ADHD medication is significantly impacted, because you're not meant to take stimulant medications when you have PTSD, because it acts on the same areas of the brain that house your memory. So when I first started the medications, it was walking a tightrope, trying to find the right dose, the right medication that was going to impact me to maximize the benefit, while also keeping flashbacks, nightmares to a minimum. And at this point, I could be significantly more productive if I was on the full adult dosage that I was supposed to. But I don't have the capacity to do that without doing far more harm than good. And so medicating earlier, at least exploring medications earlier, it can seem scary, but the results of not could potentially be far harsher, and you can't go back. If a medication isn't going to be right, it's not going to work. If you're not ADHD, ADHD medication is not going to work. That's going to be very evident as soon as you start taking it. So the idea that you're going to be on a medication and not actually need it is highly unlikely. And I was having this conversation with the family pediatrician, and he said to me, the main concern about prescribing dexamphetamine to late diagnosed ADHDers these days isn't the fact that we think they're going to get addicted to it. It's the fact that if you haven't been diagnosed or you haven't been medicated into your adult years, you're more likely to have developed an illicit drug problem, to the point where you're not going to be taking the medication, you're going to be selling it due to the high street value to then afford the harder stuff that you're now on. And that's as a result of the need to stimulate those areas of the brain to remain functional in a far more overwhelming world than an ADHD mind is designed for. That stimulation is constantly there. The need to stimulate those areas of the brain are always there. And so if you're not having medication do that, your body is going to crave it in other ways. And so drug and alcohol issues tend to be a very common result of being an unmedicated ADHDer. And again, then by the time you figure that out, you've got to clean your system out for your medication to then work. And you then have to potentially battle a PTSD diagnosis as well, that then limits what medications you're going to be able to take and how effective they can be for you, because you're not meant to be taking stimulant medications with PTSD. It all comes down to making sure that we're understanding our brain and what's actually going to work for us.
It's, so many thoughts. One of which here in the United States, there's been some recent research done that indicates that a significant part of our prison population is neurodivergent, and many of those ADHDers. There's just so much in what you just said. Thank you for sharing your personal experience, for one. That's just incredibly valuable, and I'm really grateful to you for doing that. In addition to consider your medication options sooner than later, where possible, what would be something that you would like an adult like yourself, who may just be coming into this information about their identity, what would you like them to know?
Reframe everything you thought you knew about yourself in light of this new information. I'm currently helping other people on this specific stage of their journey as well, because they were in the same generation that believed ADHD was something you grew out of. And I'm like, no, it's not.
Nope.
And experiencing a drug addiction, as soon as he understood the connection between the stimulation the brain was craving versus his drug addiction being a character flaw, he immediately went cold turkey. And he's like, oh, this isn't what my body needs. I actually need this. I'm like, yeah. And it was hard, but him knowing that that was the cause meant his experience of the withdrawals, he knew the why. He knew the why it was happening. He knew how to fix it, and he knew that getting his pediatric records, getting them to a new psychiatrist that could then provide him with an appropriate script, and having a clean body for that medication to act on, it's like, well, everything I've been experiencing my entire life doesn't need to be like this, and I know how to get to the other side of it. And so the hard parts that a lot of recovering addicts really struggle with, he was able to frame that in a way that made it significantly easier to deal with, because he knew what was on the other side, whereas so many recovering addicts don't. And so when you're looking back at your past, you need to make sure that the judgments of yourself are more realistic and fair, because they likely weren't before.
Yeah, that's a deeply meaningful statement to me. Understanding my neurodivergent identity gave me a way of looking at my past, which is, I make the joke that I break therapists. I have so much trauma in my past that we don't generally get past me being 7 years old before I need a new therapist, because I broke them, right? They just they don't understand how I'm a walking, breathing human being. And we haven't even gotten to the sexual trauma of my teens and 20s and beyond. We haven't even gotten to an abusive marriage, right? We haven't even gotten to the rest of my life. But because so much of my life was receiving negative evaluations of who I am as a human. I'm too much, I'm too dramatic, I'm too inappropriate, I'm too something, and then I'm not enough of a whole list of other things. The framing of me was almost entirely in the negative. And when I could understand my identity as autistic and ADHD and dyslexic and dyscalculic and a few other things, and to know what that means in terms of how I think, how I process information, why I am the way I am, I could look back at all of that and go, oh, they didn't get me, but I wasn't the problem. And so much of my life has been built around, like I said before, from my earliest memories, I was like the champion of the bullied kid, right? I would stand in front, I would prevent fights, I would stand up for the bullied kid. And I think that was just my natural attraction to removing guilt and shame and blame from my own world. I didn't enjoy that environment for myself, so I tried to protect others from it. And when you're talking about drug addiction, other mental illness challenges, things like that, there's almost nothing societally than guilt and shame and blame. We do almost no looking at the why, and potentially even less on how to help. And so I'm really grateful that you have brought out this particular aspect, and that you're framing it in such, to me, it's not just loving and compassionate, it's like reality. No, if people understood how their brains worked, they would do better to work with their brains. And because we don't know, we try anything else. And then society punishes us for it. And so thank you for being willing to be just like real, and for bringing out what is important to you, and in a way that, for me at least, continues to open my heart and mind to, okay, what is the societal environment I want to help build? And it's one that destigmatizes being the human that we are.
We need to be dismissing the notions of good and bad when it comes to the human existence, because with how much focus there's been on we must get rid of this disorder, we must get rid of this this damage, this disability, it's often then overbalanced by advocates and activists who then pull out the, well, what about the good, what about the superpowers, like this isn't a bad thing, this is an amazing thing. And it's like, the both of you need to shut up. It's just a thing. It's human. There is no good or bad. There is no superpower or curse. It's just a standard human existence with a wide range of variation that includes all of those things. Right? The idea that to be ADHD is a solely good thing or a solely bad thing, the same with being autistic or any other kind of neurodivergence. They're all just different types of human existence. They're not good or bad. They just are.
I can really appreciate that perspective, especially the way you put it. I am still going to wear my superhero cape because I like it. I like the idea that I have superpowers, so I'm not going to totally give that up. But what I am ultimately working toward and advocating for is the ability to exist as is. I don't need to justify my existence, through the lens of, well, I have a superpower. No, I don't have to justify me. I don't have to be better than average in order to be accepted. And I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, that's a little bit of what you're pushing back on, is we don't need to justify the existence any more than we should be trying to expel the existence. We simply need to acknowledge humans come in a wide range of varieties, types, personalities, perspectives, processing, identities, etc. And when we can just do that, we can start helping the individual be who they are as they are. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, and you do that with information. You can't be scared of diagnoses. You can't be concerned about what the result will mean, because when it comes to information about any form of disability diagnosis, you can't see it as good news or bad news. All information is good information. More information helps you learn about yourself. It helps you learn about your kids. It helps you learn about your clients and your students. And the more you know about them, the more they know about them, the better it is going to be for them. Because the better we know ourselves, the more secure we are, the better we can take care of ourselves. And that's the purpose of all of this. And so this historical analysis, a big part of everything I do is I'm constantly pissed off about every single study that comes out that's studying all these different aspects of neurodivergent conditions or the human existence. And it's like, okay, cool story, bro. What's your point? Like, what does this do for the communities you're even studying? It should all come back to enhancing quality of life. Otherwise, what's the point? So with this historical reframing of ADHD, it's, well, okay, well, I know why I work the way I work. I now know why the medication works, but I still don't know why I am the way I am. And this provides at least a plausible explanation as to why we exist. That once upon a time, people like us were pivotal to the survival of the society we lived in.
And I think if we can embrace your perspective, we will find ways where that's true again. Instead of being the different and the discarded, we will find our place.
Well, my husband says that that's coming with the zombie apocalypse. We will come.
That's beautiful. That's absolutely gorgeous. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So many people watching this video are now very happy. And on that note, I think we need to wrap it up. Thank you so much for sharing your personhood and your perspective so honestly and openly. It has benefited me, and I know it's going to travel to benefit